How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about hand traps in the post Rage of the Abyss format. We're about to get Rarity Bonanza next week, and it's been quite a while since Rage of the Abyss has released. We've had a couple of different premiere events as well as a bunch of regionals, and the top decks are pretty much starting to forming. But what hand traps should you be playing to figure out the best way to beat these strategies, or what hand traps you should be playing if you are playing these strategies? As always in my tier list videos, I rank these cards in terms of 5 different categories. I have playable in most main decks, playable in some main decks, playable in most side decks, as well as playable in some side decks. I then have niche and just don't play it. These 6 categories are super important because they give us an idea of what hand traps really are that impressive in the format today and how often certain decks will be playing them in their lists. And just because one card is higher up on the tier list than another card is, doesn't mean it's necessarily a better card than the other one. It really comes down to what is the tier actually named. If we see a card that is a very heavy side deck staple, then it's going to be in the side deck, even though it may see more overall play than cards in the main deck. So keep in mind that when you're looking at the tier list, really look at what the names of the tiers are, and that'll give you an idea of where I actually believe these cards are ranked in the competitive format. Now, if you guys are excited for the video, then do me a favor and smash the like button. If this video can hit 200 likes, I'll bring you the ultimate tier list to the best board breakers in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh as well. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, but with that being said, here are the best hand traps in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Let's jump into it. Starting off in alphabetical order, we have Artifact Lancea. Now, Lancea is a really good card, there's no denying that, but the card is super niche and there aren't many decks that are that weak to it right now. And just wait until Crossover Breakers releases and we get Malice coming out. Then Artifact Lancea is going to see a lot of play, but for the time being, it's really not going to be that popular. So because of that, I would put Artifact Lancea in the just don't tier. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is arguably one of the best cards in the game, even to this day, and in my opinion should see play in pretty much every single deck for 2 specific reasons. First of which is that its effect is so incredibly generic and widely applicable to so many different effects that you can always find at least 1 or 2 effects at the minimum that certain decks need to resolve that can be negated by Ash Blossom. For example, even a deck like Centurion, which can play around Ash Blossom pretty well, is still kind of annoyed when their effect of Primera gets negated. And the second reason why Ash Blossom is going to see a lot of popularity this format is because of the Mulcharmy monsters, Fuwalos and Purelia, which I'll be talking about later on in this video. These 2 cards are extremely problematic, and their effects can be negated by Ash Blossom, which is really good and allows you to kind of play freely. In my opinion, Ash Blossom is just too good not to play, so for that reason it belongs in the playable in most main decks tier. Moving on to the Bystial monsters, specifically Bystials Magnamut, Druisworm, and Baldrake. These are the 3 most popular ones, and in my opinion they form a great trio of side deck cards. The reason why is because there are so many decks in the format today that are really weak to the Bystial monsters. Let's start by talking about how good they are against a deck like Belle, which is of course made up of primarily dark monsters with the exception of the Fiendsmith cards, which are light monsters. This is really good because, especially right now with Lacrima the Crimson Tears being released in Rage of the Abyss, people are now summoning out Lacrima to their side of the field with the effect of Requiem and then sending the Fiendsmith to the graveyard to then use its effect to revive itself back. If you can Bystial the Fiendsmith Engraver there, that puts you in a really good position to stop them from getting access to Desiree. Bystials are also really good against any deck using the Azamina cards, because all the Azamina monsters are dark, which is really critical. If your opponent summons out a Resalago and then sends it to graveyard and uses the effect of Hallowed to shuffle it back and add it to hand, if you Bystial the Resalago, they can no longer get back their Hallowed Azamina, which means they can no longer get to Ilya Sylvia, which is going to be the payoff and the Omni-Negate for this archetype. They're super solid against decks like Centurion to banish a card like Gargoyle, for example, which can recycle itself after being used for a Synchro Summon and then be used for an additional Synchro Summon later on, and they're also of course going to be really good against any deck using IP Masquerena by putting it into the graveyard, including decks like Snake Eyes and Fire King. In my opinion, they're super underrated, and a package of 1 Baldrake, 1 Magnamut, and 1 Druisworm in the side deck is a great choice, and personally I would play these cards in most side decks. Chaos Hunter is a really situational card that doesn't come up very often. It has its appeal, but it doesn't really work that well in practice, so for that reason, just don't play it. Contact C can also be really good in the right situation, specifically against a deck like Tenpai Dragon because it forces them to use a non-dragon monster for synchro material. Now that's more so just annoying than anything else, and against most other decks, it's being used as essentially free SP material or as material for something like a Forbidden Droplet. So in reality, it's just not that good. So just don't play Contact C. DD Crow is just about as good as Bystials when you look at it because it can affect any card in the graveyard. That includes cards like Promethean Princess, Fire King Garunix. It also includes something like Hallowed Azamina or OSS to stop them from getting their graveyard effects, which does have its application. The problem with it though is that it doesn't give you an actual body on the field, and that's where the Bystials have a leg up. Sure, there are a lot of really good light and dark monsters, and there are a lot of really good other cards that are in the graveyard, but the best ones right now are light and dark, and that's why Bystials, in my opinion, had the leg up over DD Crow. If you want to play DD Crow, you absolutely can, and I feel like the biggest advantage is that it's a card you discard to the graveyard and don't summon out to the field, which is kind of nice, but it doesn't give you that bonus effect or bonus body, so for that reason I would put it into the niche tier. Dimension Shifter is easily the most toxic card on this list. I hate dealing with Shifter, and sure, cards like Mulcharmy Fuwalos kind of give you a choice. Do you want to play the game and give your opponent a ton of cards, or do you want to just pass turn? Shifter doesn't really do that. It says if you're playing a deck that needs to use the graveyard, your turn is now over, and that in my opinion is ridiculous. And as someone who's been playing a deck like White Forest Toy Box or White Forest Runic, which I've been loving right now, I can't play under Shifter, so yeah, there's a bit of bias here, but the fact that it turns off the core aspect of my entire strategy is ridiculous, and I'm not the only player that feels that way. But that being said, it is a phenomenal card for decks that can use it, and because of that, if your deck can play it, you should be playing it, period, point blank. But not every deck can, and that's why I'm putting it in the playable in some main decks tier. Finally, a brand new hand trap for me to talk about on these videos, we have Dominus Impulse. This card, released in Rage of the Abyss, is incredible. The opening weekend for this card at YCS Niagara was insane. The card was absolutely everywhere because there were so many decks that were playing fire, water, and dark strategies. And if you're playing those attributes, you're going to be in a really good position because Dominus Impulse is like a better version of so many other hand traps. It stops any effect that would special summon, which is so damn good. And if you have a trap engraved, like you used Infinite Impermanence earlier in the turn, you can destroy that card too, which is very useful. Just think about it. You want to use the effect of Snake Eye Ash to summon from deck? Impulse negates. How about Garunix to summon from the hand? Impulse negates. You can use Chandra in the battle phase and you can still have Impulse negating, which is so incredibly strong. The only restriction for Dominus Impulse is you can no longer use the effects of wind, light, and earth monsters, which for so many decks, they don't care at all. Think of a deck like Tenpai Dragon. Their entire deck is basically fire monsters, so it doesn't really matter at all. Same goes for Snake Eye and kind of YuBelle if they're not playing the Fiendsmith cards, but at that point, are they really playing YuBelle? Either way, the point is, you can build a deck and have Dominus Impulse be an amazing card for you, and if you don't have access to it, you're definitely playing at a disadvantage. Now obviously, just like Dimension Shifter, you have to play a deck that can actually utilize this card. I'm not going to say, hey, play Voiceless Voice and include Dominus Impulse. That's a terrible decision. And because of that, because there's going to be limitations to what decks you can play Dominus Impulse in, I'm going to say it's playable in some main decks. Dominus Purge, however, is, to put it lightly, not as good as Dominus Impulse. Sure, it has some really nice effects at stopping any card from going from deck to hand, which is really nice, and the restriction on this from using dark, fire, and water attributes is a little bit more restricted than something like Dominus Impulse restriction, but the card is still not bad for the decks that can use it. Problem is, right now there aren't that many decks that can effectively use this card to the best of their abilities. The Fiendsmith cards are all light monsters, but the majority of the time, Fiendsmith is being paired with other attributes that are part of the other trio, so you can't really use the Fiendsmith cards while playing Dominus Purge. Right now, in my opinion, the best card, or the best deck rather, at using Dominus Purge is easily going to be Voiceless Voice, and the deck is pretty much rogue at best right now. Eventually, we'll get to a format where Dominus Purge is really, really good, but right now it's just not the case, so for that reason, it goes in the niche tier. Up next is Droll and Lockbird, and Droll is still an incredible card in this format, and it's really good for multiple different reasons, but the biggest one is going to be, it is essentially going to be a turn ender against many different strategies. If your opponent starts off with a copy of Ponix in their hand, they normal summon that card and get to search for a copy of their Fire King Sanctuary, and you hit them with a Droll right here, they can no longer get their search with the Fire King Island and Destruction, which is really important at stopping their plays. It's also really good at shutting down the Azamina combo because the main playmaker in that strategy is going to be the effect of Deception, which they have to activate to search for Hallowed Azamina. You can then Droll them here, and then they can no longer get any other searches in the rest of the turn. But it's also really good because there are so many Mulcharmies running around in the format. If you can give your opponents one draw off of Mulcharmy Fuwalos or Purelia, and you can hit them with a Droll and Lockbird. Sure, you're drolling yourself, which can hurt in the wrong situations, but it can also stop them from getting so much advantage that could be a bonus for you. It's not a perfect card because it really relies on your opponent to do something, and sometimes they can just play around it. It also can't be used under Dimension Shifter, but the card is still fantastic and in my opinion belongs as playable in most main decks. Effect Veiler is just standard effect negation that you can only use on your opponent's turn, and it also can't be used under Shifter, surprise surprise. The card is really strong though because so many players really don't want to deal with more copies of Infinite Impermanence, and the fact that Veiler isn't once per turn is really nice. The issue is, the card doesn't see that much play right now because there are so many other amazing hand traps in the format. Just think about it, if you're going to be playing copies of Fuwalos or Purelia, Ash Blossom, Infinite Impermanence, Droll and Lockbird, Dimension Shifter even in your strategy, you're running out of main deck space, and that's why it becomes kind of difficult to fit Effect Veiler in every strategy. But I will say that if you're playing a deck with so many available spaces for hand traps, like 20 or so, I would definitely recommend playing Effect Veiler because it's a great card, it's a great hand trap that's not hard once per turn, and can be paired with other hand traps to be maximum effective. So for that reason, I would say that Effect Veiler is playable in some main decks. Moving on to Infinite Impermanence, which is going to be always covered right after Effect Veiler because they're just so similar. Well, I mean, Imperm is like the upgraded version of Effect Veiler because you can use it on your turn and on your opponent's turn, which is really nice, but also because it's not a monster card, meaning cards like Triple Tactic Talents and Triple Tactic Thrust, which just got announced for reprints in Rarity Bonanza, aren't going to be as impactful on you if you use a copy of Infinite Impermanence. Effect Negation is almost always going to be really strong, and there are so many decks that really hate dealing with Infinite Impermanence at the wrong time. And honestly, in my opinion, Imperm is arguably the best hand trap on this list, even with all the upgrades we've seen to cards like Dominus Impulse, Mulcharmy Fuwalos, the resurgence of Ash Blossom, and so on. I still believe that Infinite Impermanence belongs in the playable in most main decks tier. Fantastical Dragon Phantazmay should never see main deck play in this format. We're just not in a situation where there's going to be many decks that use link monsters, and even so, there are still so many other decks right now that use synchros or fusions as their primary summoning mechanic, and that just makes Fantastical a dead card in your hand. Fantastical has essentially just been power crept out of the game, and for that reason I believe it belongs in the niche tier. Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion is also a very good card, but not in this format. Sure, it can have a lot of utility against certain strategies, and it's really good against the very specific interactions in almost every single deck. The problem is Ghost Belle just isn't good enough right now. When you look at all the different cards in the format today, the ones that are best are going to act as two forms of interruption. Number one, they're forcing your opponent's action to be negated, which is really good, and second, they're removing a card from your opponent's hand. Ghost Belle essentially is going to be making you go -1 in card economy. If you're going to use an effect of a card in the graveyard to special summon it, and you Ghost Belle here, then your opponent ended up going even in card advantage, and you went -1, which is one of the reasons why it's not seeing as much play right now. Eventually, it'll climb back up in popularity, but I feel like for the time being, it belongs in the niche tier. As for Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill, this card is also really cool. Being targeted effect negation is really nice. You do have to use it when your opponent special summons the monster, which can be a little annoying depending on the deck you're playing, but the card also has a lot of utility for time situations, and the fact that it's a card that you can activate both on your turn and your opponent's, regardless of if you control a card or not. So it kind of is like the middle between Imperm and Veiler in a lot of situations, and those three cards are all very similar. I do believe that right now Mourner is probably the worst of the bunch, but it still is a very solid card nonetheless. And just like Effect Veiler, if you have space in your main deck for it, I would definitely consider it as an option. And for that reason, I would say that Ghost Mourner is playable in some main decks. As for Ghost Ogre, this card is terrific this format against so many different cards. When you think about it, against a deck like Belle, you can hit something like the Nightmare Throne or the Nightmare Pain, which is going to be the most common, and you can get rid of a lot of advantage the opponent would get. It's also really good against any deck using the Azamina cards because Deception doesn't activate on the placement of the card. You activate it, you then use the effect, tribute a monster, and then boom, you Ghost Ogre. And that forces your opponent to lose 2 cards while you only lose 1, which is obviously going to give you some major card advantage. But of course, I do have to mention it is once again another hand trap that you can't activate under Dimension Shifter, which does make it a little bit difficult. But that being said, I still believe it's a very strong card and should be playable in some main decks. Up next is Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries, and I'll keep this very short. This card should not see play. Even in formats where it was a tier 0 format and we had to get rid of one specific extra deck card, like for example Tierlist, this card never saw any play and should not see play right now when the format is as wide and diverse as it really is. So to reiterate, just don't play Ghost Reaper. As for Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood, this card does have some application. Exclusively as like a time card, but still it does have some application in this format. It really is going to be seeing a lot of play, mostly when you're going to game 3 or going to time in the round, because it has a way for you to interact with your opponent while you're not going first, and that gives you an opportunity to kind of steal a win or tie a game when you would have lost it. But obviously, if you're playing a more relaxed tournament where time really isn't that much of a factor, or you're playing Master Duel, this card is practically useless. So I would say put it into some side decks. No material is bad. Don't play it. Mulcharmy Fuwalos is the most dominant card on this list as of right now. The card is incredibly powerful and so many players are trying to figure out how do I best play around this card to effectively deal with all the advantage my opponent's going to get, while also making my board strong enough to withstand the crackback. But here's the thing with Fuwalos. While it's objectively a great card and deserves to be the most expensive card in Rage of the Abyss, the card itself isn't always going to be the dominant force it could possibly be. There are some decks where if your opponent activates Fuwalos, they're just going -1, which can hurt them quite a bit. You can just set a bunch of cards face down if you're playing Labyrinth. You can normal summon Robina if you're playing Fluwandereeze. You can also set up a board that's going to be maybe giving them one draw and that's it, and you can still set up something very scary. But in other situations, it's going to be incredibly oppressive and force you to pretty much end your turn. So really it's kind of a weird dichotomy. You have either a do nothing card when you're playing against very specific decks, or you have a card that can shut down opposing plays entirely. And that's really, really powerful. And for that reason, because it has that potential, I would say it belongs to be playable in most main decks. As for Mulcharmy Purelia, this card is also very good, but it's much less generic, which means it's not going to see as much consistent main deck play. Sure, there are some decks, especially going second decks like Tenpai Dragon, that really want to play copies of Purelia because it can get them extra draws, but most decks aren't going to do that. Filling up their main deck with 6 Mulcharmies can be a little bit difficult to then draw into the non-engine they really want to find, because every time you're adding in a Mulcharmy, you're reducing the chance you're going to be drawing into a regular hand trap during the course of your turn. That being said, it's a great side deck card because if you want to find very specific side deck choices, you can use both Fuwalos and Purelia to help you draw into those cards, which can be really nice. But going into game 1, there's no reason to have it in the main deck in my opinion, because a lot of the time you're going to get, 1, 2, maybe 3 draws off of it if you're lucky, and I feel like that's just not good enough right now to consider it as a main deck staple when Fuwalos exists. But I still think it's a fantastic choice, and for that reason I would say that Mulcharmy Purelia belongs to be playable in most side decks. Nibiru is obviously a great card. We've known this for a long time, and everyone playing a combo deck has to worry about Nibiru at some point or another. I mean, if they can't establish an Omni or Monster Negate before that. That's besides the point though. Nib is a great choice this format because of the Fuwalos and Purelia. Of course, these cards are really good and they can get you extra draws, but if your opponent is just playing freely saying, you know what, I'll play into your copies of Fuwalos or Purelia, and you draw a bunch of cards, eventually you might find a copy of Nibiru, which can really turn a lot of what they want to do offline. It's also great because there are some decks that really hard lose to Nib. If you nib them at the right time after their 5th summon, you're going to be in a great spot because they just can't recover the way they wanted to. Other decks on the other hand, like for example Fire King or Snake Eyes, even to an extent Belle, they can recover quite nicely, but it's not always going to be the case. On its own, Nib is kind of lackluster nowadays because there's so much recovery that these decks have access to and easy access to some Omni Negates. But I still believe that Nibiru paired with other hand traps is an elite combination, and for that reason, Nibiru in my opinion belongs to be playable in some main decks. PSY-Framegear Gamma and by extension PSY-Framegear Delta aren't going to see that much play, mostly because you have to play the copy of Driver in your deck as well, and not many decks can afford to do that. On top of that, Gamma being the monster negate and being limited to 1 copy really hurts. If the card was at 3 copies, it would see so much more play, but for the time being, it's just a niche card. Sauravis the Ancient and Ascended is essentially just targeting protection and really only sees play in one specific deck, and that's going to be Voiceless Voice, so by definition, it's going to be a niche card. Skullmeister is not a hard once per turn, which is great for this card and gives it an advantage over other hand traps. The problem is, its effect really is kind of lackluster. With a card like DD Crow or Ghost Belle or Bystials, you can do a bit more than just negate an effect in the graveyard, and most effects that would be activated by Skullmeister can also be shut down by other effects of other hand traps we've already spoken about. In my opinion, it's a niche card. Token Collector is bad. don't play it. And there you have it. That there is my tier list for the best hand traps in the post Rage of the Abyss competitive format. What'd you think of my list? Let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. If you disagree with anything, let me know. We'll talk about it. We'll see where you disagree and how we can have a discussion about it to maybe convince each other, we'll say. Either way, if you enjoyed the video, do me a favor and smash the like button. If we hit 200 likes on the video, I'll bring you the ultimate tier list for the best board breakers in Yu-Gi-Oh as well. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all next time.